Hey guys, so we've just entered the second week of Canada's federal election where we will be choosing a new Prime Minister, and voting day is set for April 28th. Now, I am not a partisan, I'm a civil libertarian, so what I'm doing is I'm watching all of the different parties and what they're committing to in terms of protecting fundamental freedoms and Canada's Constitution, and in particular, I'm watching for commitments to protect freedom of expression, which is an issue I care so much about. Now, parties used to put out these comprehensive, long policy documents, little books. That's how detailed they actually used to be. And these policy books explained exactly what the party would do if they were elected to power. Now, those days are long gone. We no longer expect these comprehensive policy documents. These little books have been sort of replaced with individual commitments that are made over the course of the writ period, the election period leading up to April 28th. And it can be hard to keep track of these. Politicians often don't address all of the issues that many people care about, and the ideas are kind of dripped out slowly over this longer period. In this election, the leading issues right now include affordability, housing, immigration, inflation, the Trump tariffs, and access to healthcare and the environment are sort of evergreen issues in every Canadian election. And look, I care a lot about these issues as well. I think these are all important issues, but I want to know what the parties are promising in terms of Canada's constitutional protections. Will a new government have bold commitments to protect free speech? Will the next government respect the jurisdiction of the provinces? Look, I would frankly be surprised if any of the parties make these issues policy priorities, or even if they talk about them at all. So in that case, how are we supposed to know what the parties actually stand for? So I had an idea, and this is imperfect, but what I've done is looked at the policy conventions that the three major parties have had in the last 3 years and looked at the policy resolutions coming out of those conventions. At these conventions, party members vote on the issues that they think should be priorities for the parties. Now, the leader of the party can choose to accept or not accept these recommendations, but kind of in the absence of comprehensive policy documents, these policy resolutions at least give us a window into the thinking within the parties. So I have had a look at the policy resolutions from the 2024 Conservative Convention and the 2023 Liberal and NDP conventions. Now, I've gone through the whole thing, but what I'm going to talk about in this video is the policy commitments in those resolutions to freedom of speech in particular. I can't wait to tell you all about it. If you're new here, welcome. My name is Christine, and I'm the Litigation Director at the Canadian Constitution Foundation, a legal charity that fights for fundamental freedoms in Canada. I upload regular videos about our ongoing cases and about other interesting developments in constitutional law in Canada. So if that sounds like something you'd be interested in, please hit like and subscribe below. It really helps my videos out a lot. And also, please remember, nothing in my videos is ever legal advice. If you have your own legal question or problem, please consult your own lawyer. Okay, so before I get into what the resolutions from these conventions from the major parties talk about on freedom of expression, first I want to tell you why I think freedom of expression needs to be a priority in this campaign. Freedom of expression is the foundation of democracy, and it allows us to define the contours of all of our other rights. Political speech in particular is more than just self-expression, it's the very essence of self-government. And the gift of free expression to civilization has ancient roots dating back to Socrates, and so do attempts to silence this right. After all, Socrates was ultimately killed for his speech. The right to free expression gives us the power to advocate for ourselves against the power of the state, and it's the first instinct of authoritarian regimes to silence the speech of critics so it can go about repression with total impunity. Now, in Canada, we have seen the recent rise of censorship through things like introduction of federal legislation like the Online Harms Act, the Digital Streaming Act, and the Online News Act. We've seen expanding claims of professional regulation regulators over the private lives of doctors, nurses, accountants, and lawyers who these regulators discipline for unpopular or heterodox political or cultural commentary. We've seen local governments, municipal governments, making absurd claims about their power to restrict protests in public spaces. And we've seen the first ever invocation of the Federal Emergencies Act in response to a nonviolent domestic political protest in 2022. I think that Western civilization is at an inflection point when it comes to free speech and censorship. We need to consider the direction that we're going as a free society and whether or not we want to become another example of increased censorship or an example to the world on the value of open discourse free from fear. Now, Canada is not alone in backsliding on free expression. There's rising censorship in Europe and yes, also in the United States. I have a forthcoming op-ed in the National Post about this issue. Now, as the rest of the world regresses towards authoritarian censorship, this is an opportunity for Canada to become a beacon of light towards a freer future. Canada should aspire to being a vibrant nation with legal and cultural protections for expression, where every citizen can voice their wildest dreams and their sharpest criticisms without fear of censorship or retribution. Now is the time to make free speech a priority. But where do Canada's federal political parties stand on free expression? Now, if one party leader during this campaign comes out and talks about free expression and makes some sort of commitment to it, I'm going to be sure to talk about it here on this channel. So subscribe to make sure if that does happen, I'll do a video and you will catch it. But in the meantime, in the absence of firm commitments right now, I've had a look at the party convention resolutions from 2024 and 2023. Let's go through them. So first, let's have a look at the Liberals. Now, the first thing I did when doing this search was Control F the policy documents for the words free speech or censor or censorship. And with the Liberal policy resolution document, nothing comes up. But they do talk about free speech and censorship indirectly in a few ways. But you may not be surprised to hear this, but it is not good. First, there's a resolution called Combating Disinformation in Canada. I'll put the resolution up here, but I'll go through it. It basically says, whereas online information sources are the source of most disinformation aimed at or available to Canadians, and those who produce misinformation seek to undermine trust in people and institutions, including mainstream media and governments, and where the demand for information 24/7 has increased, and to reduce costs, the media no longer employs as many reporters, and the result has been a devalued mainstream media and source of news information. So that's the preamble or the whereas, and then the Liberals propose a solution, which is public funds for ad-free news and information by Canadian media through an arm's length, nonpartisan mechanism, and exploring options to hold online information services accountable for the veracity of material published on their platforms and to limit publication to only material whose sources can be traced. Now, this would be a form of censorship and a pretty broad one and likely unconstitutional because the Liberals had actually implemented an anti-disinformation law which we challenged and had struck down at the CCF, and that was because the law then captured too much speech. It actually criminalized mistakes. We had that struck down, but now the Liberal policy resolution is proposing a new, probably worse version of it. The problem with this proposal, as was the problem with the 2020 law, is that it's actually often politicians themselves sharing misinformation. For example, in this campaign, one former Liberal MP posted a tweet that claimed that a photo of notorious Ghislaine Maxwell, she's the partner of the infamous sex criminal Jeffrey Epstein, there was a photo of her with Mark Carney, the Liberal leader. And this Liberal former MP claimed that this photo was photoshopped. Now, this photo was not photoshopped. It's actually a real photo. And in fact, Carney has explained the photo. And we can take Carney at his word that, you know, he says he's not friends with Ghislaine Maxwell, but this was not a fake photoshopped photo. It's a real photo. And while there are actually some fake photos now circulating, that particular one is real. So this claim by this former Liberal MP of this politician, this is actually misinformation that he's spreading online. So he would be captured by this law. In another example, there's a Liberal candidate, he's a former journalist named Evan Solomon. He retweeted a post from a parody account called Mark Carney's Ego, and that tweet had an offensive slogan written on the side of the Liberal campaign bus. This was a fake photo, but he posted it as if it was real, I think by mistake. So it seems like the Liberal policy resolution that is in this document that would, quote, hold Twitter accountable for these posts would in fact punish either Twitter or these candidates for sharing this misinformation. And in fact, the resolution goes further. It says that these posts shouldn't be allowed at all because their sources cannot be traced. Now, this is such a bad idea. And while these posts that these two politicians put up are false, I actually think they should be allowed to post things that are false like this. I think it's actually helpful to know that certain political candidates are easily tricked or are stupid or that they are liars. It's valuable in knowing that information about a political candidate, and we shouldn't prohibit it through policy proposals like this one from the Liberal Convention in 2023. Now, there's a similar problem in another resolution from the 2023 convention called Truth in Politics. Now, this resolution, I'll put it up on the screen, says Canadians are facing an onslaught of political disinformation and deliberate misrepresentation. Political deception erodes public trust, decreases voter turnout, increases polarization, and leads to the rise of uninformed and extreme views and movements. Canada has no federal laws to prevent politicians from deliberately misleading the public. Political advertising is currently exempt from false advertising restrictions, and goes on. And the resolution then proposes a solution that the government develops truth in advertising legislation to be administered by an independent body, including the ability to impose sanctions. And it also proposes that the chief electoral officer develop a code of conduct for federal political parties, candidates, and third parties. Now, this, of course, has the same issues as the last resolution, including, I will add, that it puts some government agency in charge of determining what actually constitutes disinformation, which is problematic in itself because, as we have learned, and as many of us know, what some people claim is disinformation later turns out to actually, in fact, be correct and true. So we shouldn't criminalize it and prohibit it. We should get to the truth through debate and discourse, not through censorship. Now, those were the only two resolutions that I think relate to freedom of expression from the Liberal 2023 convention. Let's look at what the NDP have proposed. Again, like the Liberals, nothing directly about free expression, but there are a few interesting resolutions that could relate to expression. There's a proposal on regulation to AI, which I'll put up here. You know, the resolution calls for strong policies that hold employers accountable for the use of AI and ensuring that workers and unions are engaged before it's used in a workplace, and to ensure that workers' safety is not compromised or job losses are limited through when AI is introduced. Now, this is not directly related to expression, but I thought that this was an interesting resolution because AI is an emerging tool and it is used for expressive purposes, and this resolution is deeply hostile to it. Now, there's another resolution that, again, isn't directly tied to freedom of expression, but it's a really dramatic proposal about a declaration of an emergency over what the NDP calls the genocide against Indigenous and 2S LGBTQIA+ people. Now, I will be honest, I have heard the statements, including statements by the Prime Minister, that Canada's historic treatment, and I think ongoing treatment of Indigenous people constitutes a genocide, but this is the first time I have heard it claimed that there is a genocide being committed against 2S LGBTQIA people. So that one was news to me. The resolution then proposes issuing an emergency proclamation. Now, I'm not sure under what power they are proposing this, but it is using the language of the Emergencies Act. And obviously that would not constitute an emergency under the threshold of the Emergencies Act. This extraordinary federal law, the Emergencies Act, gives Cabinet the power to create new laws. I do not see why that would be needed or how that threshold could possibly be met. And I don't understand what special powers Cabinet actually needs to deal with criminal offenses, scourge on society, but I do not see how the threshold is met here. So maybe I'm misunderstanding this resolution, but it does not sound good to me to issue a declaration of an emergency under the Emergencies Act for what the NDP calls the ongoing genocide of Indigenous people and 2S LGBTQIA people. I also am skeptical, frankly, that the definition of genocide is met. I think that's an inappropriate use of the term genocide. There is no ongoing genocide of either of these groups in Canada right now. And to say that there is actually devalues that term, which has a really specific meaning in law. There's also another NDP resolution from the Policy Convention about LGBTQ2S+. This time they did not include IA and they didn't start with 2S. I don't know why the change there. And this resolution deals with Pride Month and what they say was sustained, organized, and well-resourced homophobic and transphobic violence at Canadian schools. The resolution condemns homophobia, transphobia, hate, bullying, bigotry, intimidation, and violence. Now, I also condemn these things, but the issue here is what actually meets the threshold for transphobia or homophobia or hate or bullying or bigotry. Now, there remains a lot of debate about what these terms actually mean, and I'll give you a few examples. For example, if I were to say that I do not believe that trans women, so people born male, if I do not believe that they should participate in women's sports, some people might say that that is transphobic. If I were to say trans women must be allowed to participate in women's sports, others might say that is discriminatory against women. That's a bigotry against women. Who is right? Which one is it? Who is going to decide what is discrimination, hate, or transphobia? Well, if the NDP are the ones defining that, we can probably get a little bit of insight into what they're thinking about based on looking at a white paper that is actually referenced in one of their other resolutions. There's a white paper on the status of trans and gender diverse people, and one of the NDP policy resolutions calls for the adoption of the 29 recommendations in that white paper. And one of those recommendations, recommendation 21, is to adopt incentives for sports organizations to, quote, not adopt trans exclusionary policies. So in other words, to create incentives to allow for trans women in women's sports. The NDP has a specific definition of what would constitute transphobia, and this might meet it. And further to that, resolution says that the NDP government would never grant public funds to educational institutions that harbor discriminatory practices. So if we take this a little bit further, it could mean that the NDP would not grant public funds to a university where women's sports are for women and exclude trans women. Now, I think that this is a expression issue as well as an overall fairness issue. So that's sort of it for the NDP policy resolutions. Let's have a look at the Conservative policy resolutions. Now, this is a more recent convention. It was from 2024. And when I control F in the document, the words free speech, there are 4 results. And when I control F censorship or censor, there are 2 results. So that's a good start. They're actually talking directly about this issue. But there was something interesting at the very beginning of the Conservative policy document that I found really interesting that the other 2 did not. And this was a declaration on the role of government, which I'll put up here. Now, this resolution doesn't mention free speech specifically, but it talks about creating an environment where individuals can prosper. And in my opinion, individuals cannot prosper without strong guarantees for the right to free speech. Now, there were actually a lot of resolutions here that indirectly dealt with freedom of expression as well. There was a resolution about reviewing Canada's access to information system, which frankly is broken. I use it. And an open and accountable government is vital to the right to freedom of expression as well as freedom of the press. So improving that system is really an important priority for me. I think it should be for the next government, and I was pleased to see this was talked about at the 2024 Conservative Policy Convention. There were also some specific resolutions on the importance of the judiciary as an independent body and on the courts and the charter. I'll put these up, but I think that it's absolutely excellent to advocate for an independent judiciary. It's also excellent to affirm that it is Parliament and not the courts who make the law, which is what these resolutions do. And I also notice here there's a resolution to remove Section 13 of the Canada Human Rights Act. Now, this actually never came into force. This was what was going to be proposed as a civil remedy for hate speech as part of Bill C-63. That legislation is dead. It never passed. So this resolution is actually moot, but it was good to include it because that's literally something I called for the government to do. This Conservative resolution also affirms the legitimacy of Section 33 of the Charter. This is the notwithstanding clause. Now, we know that Pierre Poilievre has talked about this. Poilievre has expressed concern that judges are imposing really light sentences on criminals on the basis that they find higher sentences would be unconstitutional. Perhaps the most famous of these cases involved mass murderer Alexandre Bissonnette, who murdered about a dozen people in Quebec City who were in the middle of praying. The court said that it would be cruel and unusual punishment to make Bissonnette ineligible for parole for more than 40 years. So that penalty was unconstitutional. I do not agree with the Bissonnette decision. I think it is completely appropriate to put someone in jail for a long period for mass murder. It's horrific what Bissonnette did. And it seems like Poilievre also agrees that this is a really problematic decision. He has said that he would invoke the notwithstanding clause in response to cases like Bissonnette. Now, the resolution here from the Policy Convention, it just says that Section 33 is legitimate. And of course it is. It's part of our Constitution. Our Constitution can't be unconstitutional. But that said, Section 33 has never been used federally, and I do think that we need to be really careful with it. I don't think that its use would be illegitimate, but I have concerns about what the use of Section 33 would mean, what precedent it would set for its use. Even if it's used in a way that I happen to agree with, there's a problem that once you break that glass, once someone uses that tool, it could be used again by a future government in a way that I really disagree with and that undermines civil liberties in a really dangerous way. There are also two Conservative Policy Convention resolutions specifically dealing with free speech. One on the recognition of the value of free speech and one on protecting free speech on campus. I'll put them up on the screen now. Now, the guarantee for freedom of expression on campus includes a commitment to the Chicago Principles. The Chicago Principles are great. They are a set of guidelines developed by the University of Chicago in 2014 that affirm that university's commitment to free speech and to academic freedom. At their core, the Chicago Principles assert that universities must prioritize free, robust, and uninhibited debate and deliberation among everyone in their community. And they emphasize that it's the role of the university not to shield individuals from ideas that they find disagreeable, offensive, or even deeply upsetting, but instead to foster an environment where such ideas can be openly expressed, challenged, and debated. A lot of universities, including Canadian universities, actually already have some version of this, although I acknowledge that they are definitely implementing it imperfectly. Now, failure to protect free expression, according to the Conservative policy resolution here, would result in losing funding. My concern here is who is defining and determining whether or not a university has failed to protect freedom of expression. It seems like probably the government according to this resolution, and I have concerns about that, including concerns about ideological bias as well as arbitrariness. But I will admit that I also think the bigger risk is actually what we are already seeing, which is the silencing of speech on campus. Another conservative policy resolution that I think could deal with freedom of expression is about family. I'll put it up on the screen here, but basically what I think is interesting here is that there's this commitment that it is the right and duty of a parent to raise their own children responsibly according to their own conscience and beliefs, and then no person, government, or agency has a right to interfere except through due process. Now, this can relate to expression because the way we raise our children and the values that we teach them are expressions of our core and foundational beliefs, and the government must not interfere with that except through due process. For example, in cases where there is abuse, there is a system in place to deal with that. But families and parents raise children, not the government, and you have a right to express your values to your children through what you teach them and how you raise them. There are also two resolutions about what seem to be compelled speech. First, there's a resolution about what is called a government values attestation. This appears directed at DEI statements or diversity, equity, inclusion statements, but there's also an even more specific resolution about compelled speech that calls free speech a hallmark of a free society, and that compelled speech is a violation of the charter, that individuals' freedom of thought, belief, opinion, expression supersede all compelled speech. This is good. Freedom of expression also protects the right not to express yourself, and there's a lot of case law on this, cases like Slate Communications, RJR McDonald, National Bank of Canada, and retail clerks. Forcing someone to say certain words really strikes at the core of that person's identity. And silence is in itself a form of expression, and compelled speech can constitute a restriction on the right to freedom of expression. There are a lot more policy resolutions in all of these documents, so I'll post a link to all of the documents below. You can read them yourself. Again, these are not election platforms. We do not have those. We don't know if we actually will have them. These are just grassroots policy resolutions from members of these parties. But I think that they do give us some insight into and some information about what the leaders and the members of these parties might be thinking in what we currently have, which is an information vacuum. So we don't have a lot else to go on. So that's why I went through these and thought it would be helpful to share with you what I found. Do any of these resolutions resonate with you? Are there any resolutions that you're concerned by? What other issues do you care about? Leave a comment below. I know I spent a lot of time on free speech. That might not be everyone's policy priority. It's a really big deal to me. Let me know if you share that, and if not, what other issues you think need to be prioritized in this campaign. Also, please make sure you subscribe to the channel, because as these parties do develop platforms, and hopefully they do, I'll talk about what they're promising here on this channel if it relates to constitutional law, Canada's constitution, and civil liberties. Okay, that's all for this update. Thanks for watching, and let's keep fighting for freedom in Canada.